This video has been heavily modified visually in order to make it past YouTube Content ID. In order to see a version of this video that is not altered in any way, go to Odyssey following the link in the description to watch the proper version of the full video. This video is part 2 of a series about Eureka 7. The first part goes over the pre-production history, as well as the first episode in extensive depth, so if you haven't seen that already, you should definitely watch that part before this one, because it's going to be launching right into episode 2. Episode 2 opens with Axel Thurston and his grandchildren at his son Adrock's grave 5 years after his death, when no one else has bothered to come back, and is explaining to them the plot of the first Proto-Men album. He states that he can't be sure if Adrock was really a hero or not, and instead sees him as someone that was taken advantage of by the people who wanted someone to give them hope. He was a martyr to the ideal of hope, and is now a symbol for hope, even though nothing about the world has actually changed, except for some to be placated by the name Adrock to feel that life is better than it must have been before. As far as Axel is concerned, Adrock let himself become an instrument of propaganda and indoctrination for school children, while accomplishing nothing of actual substance. He brought pain and suffering to his family, and is therefore in Axel's eyes mostly selfish. As Axel leaves, his granddaughter tells Renton that she still believes in her father's ideals. Don't beg for it, earn it, and then it will be granted to you. She tells Renton that he will understand these words one day, regardless of what their grandfather has to say. Those words from Adrock Thurston will be repeated many times throughout the series by various characters, and could be considered one of the main themes of the show. This theme has always clearly resonated with me, considering that I built a lifestyle and career entirely around giving myself the freedom to live by my own rules. But like Renton, I ended up tumbling through a much more hard-fought experience to get what I have than I expected, and even then I've only achieved a fraction of what I had thought possible when I was 16 and finding this message compelling to begin with. I can honestly say that I appreciate the importance of hard work more than ever before at this point in my life, and I have even more determination than I ever did before to do what I have to do to preserve the aspects of freedom that I can actually afford in this world. The reality of being a member of Gecko State isn't far off from the reality of my actual life, which is why I'm such a huge fan of the show's first arc, which exists to close that gap between Renton's expectations of his fantasy lifestyle and the reality of what will still eventually seem like a fantasy lifestyle compared to the alternative. You may remember at the end of episode 1 we left Renton in free fall, and now he wakes up from his flashback and gets liftoff, boldly proclaiming, "I can fly," like a big dork, as story writer punches in behind him, and a wave of adorable skyfish follow his wave skyward. Holland catches his first proper witness of his ex's little brother at his full current potential and can't help but smile. Renton has caught his idol's attention, and without even realizing it, he manages to pull off a cutback drop turn, just dodging enemy gunfire. I love that Matthew and Stoner are witness to this and share their own enthusiasm, really selling that feeling like being out at the beach and watching someone catch an awesome wave. Renton's approach to the Nirvash gets him knocked off of his Holland board replica, and so Eureka opens up her cockpit to catch him from the sky. It's very important to note the similarity here to the incredibly famous scene from the second episode of Kawamori Shoji-sama's Macross, in which Hikaru catches Minmay and draws her into the cockpit. This moment is pretty much the height of romantic imagery in mecha anime, and has been recreated plenty of times both within the Macross franchise and within other anime, including much more directly in one of the biggest payoff scenes in Eureka 7 in its entirety to come halfway through the show. It's because this scene is setting up for that one secretly that it pulls a role reversal, with this time the boy thudding into the girl's cockpit aromantically and throwing his arms around her in excitement over having accomplished a cutback drop turn, totally changing the atmosphere of the encounter from the very princely image of Hikaru rescuing his lady to something a little more goofy and kind of pathetic, but in a cutesy, charming kind of way. I sometimes wonder if Eureka 7's writing might have been a little too clever for its own good. I know a lot of people who hated Renton at the start, but were captivated by other aspects of the story enough to stick through it until he became tolerable in the second half of the show. But I also know a lot of people who've just been turned away by the show towards the start because of how pathetic and childish Renton seems as a protagonist. It feels like the show is maybe too honest about Renton, a little too ready to show off his flaws and really sell us on the realism of a dorky, entitled kid trying to bite off a hell of a lot more than he can chew. I think a lot of girls will find Renton cute in a little brother kind of way, especially because he's such an obvious boy that grew up admiring women. Renton falling in love with Eureka because he thinks that she understands him is actually a legitimately great reason, and exploring how he might be overestimating the levels of similarity between them, and how she might be underestimating what Renton has to offer as a human being, is an excellent basis for the limerence stages of a budding romance. When Renton announces to Eureka that he was able to do this because of being inspired by her and that he's in love with her, we can view this as cutely romantic, but also in empathy with Eureka's perspective as kind of a nuisance from someone who doesn't even know you. To me, Eureka 7 really comes to life when we get into the arc of everyone on the Gecko State hardcore hazing Renton for like half a dozen episodes, and I think that part of the show will most divide the people who end up loving it from those who end up dropping it. If you enjoy watching a character who kind of sucks being bullied into finding his place, and then slowly growing until he figures out what he's trying to do and becomes a good person, then you'll love Eureka 7. If you specifically need to feel like you want to root for the protagonist in the moment at all times, though, then you might not have such a great time. Anyways, Renton explains what his grandpa had told him to Eureka and attaches the Amida drive to her thing, causing her to go unconscious and everything to get panicked and intense right before cutting straight to the aftermath of the battle. All of the good guy mecha are resting amid a terrain converted entirely to pillars of salt, and the enemies are nowhere to be found. I'll talk more about the way this episode is structured later on when we cut back to show what actually happened in the battle, but for now I'll only say that I think the jump forward here was a little bit confusing on the first watch. Although we are quickly informed by Eureka, apparently interpreting the voice of the Nirvash itself, that Renton was the one to bring about this insane effect right before apparently losing consciousness in her lap. The results of the Seven Swell phenomenon are definitely cool looking, and the music that plays around here is one of my favorite tracks on the OST, with a palette kind of like a more relaxed version of Gwyn Lord of Cinder from Dark Souls, which would make an incredible hip-hop beat sample. After this scene, Eureka 7 takes its first really deep breaths in its writing. This little scene of Axel's friend showing up and briefly grieving over him before realizing he's alive, preceding the return of Renton and the Nirvash, is the first scene that I wouldn't consider strictly speaking necessary that has happened in the show so far. It's a cute comedy scene about giving a face to a character who had been established over the phone in the previous episode, but you could easily imagine a version of the show where this character just never appeared in the story at all. A lot of little scenes like that exist in Eureka 7, which don't necessarily make the show better or worse, but in their existence add little bits of extra dimension and believability to the scenario that makes it feel more realized. I don't feel the need to discuss every single scene of this nature in detail, and I think it's too early to start talking about how much of the show I think necessarily had to have existed or would have been actually better not to have included, but those are discussions that we will get to eventually. Skipping ahead to the next heartfelt moment, Eureka is confused to see Axel smiling at his grandson's sleeping face in spite of the recklessness with which he had just behaved. Axel responds that he's the only one who actually can compliment Renton for what he's done, and feels that he should do so even though common sense dictates otherwise, for reasons Eureka will understand when she has had children of her own. She starts to inform him that she actually does have her own kids before she gets interrupted by Holland. I think this lays a very important seed for understanding how Eureka's relationship to her children is going to evolve way later into the series. Holland's argument with Axel is even more interesting. Axel understands that Holland has made a decision to finally follow through on what his ex-lover and her father had started by taking the Amida drive, but Axel begs Holland not to drag Renton into it because he wants Renton to have a chance at a regular life. Holland argues not only that Renton clearly doesn't want a normal life and will eventually end up seeking another path anyways, but also that Axel is lying to himself, claiming that that's what he wants, when he's the one who sent Renton with the Amida drive into that battle in the first place. Axel retorts that he really does believe in a life of safety, and that Renton will one day see things the way he does as well, and he argues that he only held on to the Amida drive for so long because he considers Renton the only one with the right to use it besides Adrock. Axel's position is incredibly complicated in a way that we kind of understand implicitly on the thematic level, but we can only grasp the severity of when we know the full scope of the actual plot. What Adrock was trying to do basically meant going against the core ideas that their entire society is founded on, while his daughter was trying to prove the reality of something that's only understood in theory by very few people. They are basically the two people who came the closest to ever solving the world's problems, but they failed. If there is still any hope at all in continuing with their ambitions, it lies with Gecko State and with the Amida Drive, and possibly also with Renton. But at this point, it seems easier to imagine that all of those efforts would fail just the same, and that Axel will be left completely alone in this world at the end of his life, knowing his whole family died in vain. It's a fate that's too painful to prepare himself for, and yet he also can't live with knowing that he personally prevented the one chance that the world might have of healing from getting its shot. Axel knows that if Renton was really ready to head off, then he would do it, but that doesn't mean that he's ever going to encourage such behavior if he thinks he might be able to keep Renton in the nest and protect his life until he's able to start a family for himself. Axel may be the force of authority in Renton's life, but he's hardly the biggest influence on who Renton wants to be. And Holland himself comes right up to the kid to tell him that it's up to him to make a decision about what he wants to do. All this dorky kid can manage in response to his idol advising him directly is honmono da, meaning it's the real thing, indicating he isn't even capable still of processing that the stuff of his fantasies is actually real and in front of him. Later, Renton works up the resolve to come to Holland with an answer. Holland tells him that he only could have performed the cutback drop turn if he believes in the waves, and in turn believes in the world. Renton had been told by the ref salesman in the first episode that he sucks at boarding because he doesn't believe in the waves, the implication being that his mentality about having the worst life was the real problem, and the determination given to him by his desire to inspire those same feelings of belief in Eureka that his sister had given to him for life in general is what allowed him to believe in his ability to fly and take liftoff before the battle. Holland seems to believe that this kind of belief will inevitably send Renton on the path to joining him, but I think he severely overestimates how much Renton is capable of right now, or can even parse of what Holland is trying to tell him based on his one-time show of skills. When Holland asks Renton how he felt in the cockpit of the Nirvash, we finally cut back to see the rest of the action scene from earlier. I feel the need to make note of how the structure of this episode exactly copies that of the second episode of Neon Genesis Evangelion. I posted a video back in 2015 which discussed in depth the many brilliant things accomplished in that episode by cutting away from the action right when Shinji loses, and then slowly unveiling the results of the battle before finally giving us the main event in full at the end of the episode, instead of opening on a badass fight and then sitting around in the mellow fallout of that for the rest of the time. Eureka 7 is structured for similar dramatic purposes, but it doesn't accomplish nearly as much nuance as Eva did with its second episode. Eva pushed off the action climax in order to compel viewers through the main heap of setting establishment and world building, and it also sets up an interesting twist where the gratification of the battle's results are revealed before we fully understand how actually horrifying and insane the combat had actually been. Eureka 7 seems more interested just in getting straight back into the emotional story it was in the middle of, and breaking up the action just so it can save the badass climactic scene for the end of the episode. I think it was probably still a good thing to do things that way, although I don't think the hard cut from the action to the aftermath, nor the way that we lead back into the action, is anywhere near as dramatically noteworthy as what we got from episode 2 of Eva. The Seven Swell phenomenon is implied to be directly activated by Renton's realization about the nature of belief. After Eureka holds him and tells him to trust her, he remembers being held by his sister and seeing the name Eureka appear on his compact drive when he was a child, realizing that what he's meant to believe in isn't himself or his sister, but rather the mysterious guiding force which has led him through his life all along. It is very fair to consider Eureka 7 as a spiritual series, which already has made a number of religious references along its way, and will continue to do so for a variety of world religions along the course of its run. My guess would be that the team received a project pre-packaged with the title Eureka 7 and thought it would be a good idea to give it a heavy religious theming, and then incorporated as many threads of intrigue from different religions as they could find, and chose belief as the core theme of the series, even though I think it's possible that the specific fixation on belief may be the factor most core to the first 3 episodes that is least obviously core to the rest of the show, in a way that makes me wonder how much that specific theme was core to what director Kyoda-san was trying to communicate with the story that maybe was lost as it went along. What exactly the Seven Swell phenomenon does is kind of unclear. It looks like the world's prettiest atom bomb and causes salt pillars to cover the land, but it doesn't seem to actually destroy anything in and of itself. Instead, it just seems to confuse the enemy and possibly power up the Nirvash such that Renton's able to rip his way right through all the military mecha. We never cut into the cockpit until the action is over and Renton is passed out, so it seems most effective to think that the Nirvash was acting on its own based on the power granted to it by Renton's belief in his desire to protect Eureka. Renton states that his feeling that protecting Eureka would be proof of his belief is what compelled him to believe, and Holland says that if he really believes he can protect Eureka, then he should come with them, and that it's what Eureka wants as well. Out of his desire to protect the Amida Drive and to continue believing in this girl that now seems to believe in him, Renton is determined to join them, and the second episode is over. If episode 2 allowed Eureka 7 a deep breath, episode 3 is letting it do yoga. It's the first episode which I might accuse of having more plot than it does story, and I think it might even be a make or break episode for anyone who's giving this show the 3-episode test, because this is the point where it stops constantly introducing new ideas and images and starts going back over what it's established in order to reinforce the character and setting dynamics. The first few minutes of the episode mostly serve to establish the complicated reasons that the Gecko State is stuck where it is, and why the military is stuck in their attempt to stop them, all hinging on Holland getting out of there in time for them to make an unscathed escape. To explain what I mean by more plot than story, I'd like to break down the opening scene of the episode line for line. It opens with a shot of the Air Force base and a voice informing the commander that while it is their responsibility to keep peace in Belforest, they can't really do more than impose a curfew. Moreover, their runway is closed because of his having crashed a ship there. While they are worried about the Seven Swell phenomenon, the Air Force is also worried about getting pressure from the Aviation Corporation over the commander's reckless actions. The commander argues that the ship the Gecko, which is Gecko State's ship, which they believe to be connected to the Seven Swell phenomenon, is parked at Terminal 23 at the airport, and so they should shut them down. The Air Force begs him to allow them to save face, and he slams his fist on the monitor, telling them that this is no time to be leisurely worrying about what people think. Gecko State has submitted official documents that the other organization doesn't want to ignore, causing the commander to state that if the gates aren't open in 10 minutes, he will be opening them forcibly. The call ends, and then after a sigh, the man on the other end asks how many flights they have awaiting landing. There are 3 crafts and holding patterns and pressures from something described as the Corporation not to allow any delays, meaning that they're between a rock and a hard place. Everything I just described is the plot of what's happening here. Story-wise, we are learning a couple of things. One, the particulars of how the military's communication and bureaucracy breakdowns make the Gecko State difficult to deal with, and also the reasons for why the Gecko ended up trapped in a shutdown runway. Most of the plot details used to communicate that story were not specifically necessary, but they allowed the scenario to be fleshed out in its realism and specificity, and also for the director to pace out each scene to manage the overall tonal flow of the episode. A lot of the cutbacks to the military in the early episodes exist more for the sake of adding B-plot to break up the main story progression than they do to really establish those characters as interesting, and unfortunately they end up coming off a little bit repetitive thanks to how the actual story content of those interactions ends up usually having the same basic meaning. Military sucks, they can't communicate. Renton and Eureka get some downtime together, and Holland is shocked by the level of interest that she seems to have taken in him. Eureka tries to show Renton how to read the waves, but he's a little more captivated with her beauty. When he jumps in reaction, she calls him amusing and says he reminds her of one of her kids, leading him instantly into one of his magazines to confirm that he has been little brother zoned. Their cutesy interactions continue a bit until it's time to go catch a wave. It's here that you can really feel the show slowing all the way down and taking its time at what to me is kind of an odd moment. I was very ready for Renton to be riding on the Gecko around the world by the end of episode 2, so I felt kind of restless with how much lead up this episode gave us to Renton actually leaving on his journey. But I also do think this injection of mundanity into the story is crucial to acclimating to its overall tone, and it's probably for the best if it did feel like a massive shift in tone the second that Renton landed on the Gecko. But I definitely feel like this episode dragged out about half of the previous episode's content to the same amount of screen time. Renton's last emotional conversation with his grandfather sees him stating his intent to face the things that he's been trying to run from and to go off for training for a while, but to eventually come back and take over Axel's business. Axel is moved by this and seems to be under the mistaken impression that Renton is planning to actually train as a mechanic, so he's shocked to see Renton leaving the workshop in the Nirvash. From there, most of the rest of the episode consists of a chaotic action scene as the Nirvash reunites with the Gecko, and then the dramatic introduction of of said skyship on which most of the series will take place. It is in the tradition of Yamato, Gundam's White Base, Ideon, and Macross, and an endless number of other anime adventure serials to set the story primarily on a large mobile home base, and the Gecko is certainly no slouch on the memorability front. I only feel bad that I don't have the lexicon to break down the mechanical design in the depth that I can the writing and music. Little details characterizing Eureka drip through this episode, but most of it is more to make us curious about her than giving us a concrete sense of who she is. So I'll be getting into her in a bigger way once she's been revealed to us a little bit more by the show. My favorite scene in this episode, which I feel the need to touch on, comes after all the action and drama at the very end, when Renton finally makes it aboard the Gecko, and is crowded on by the ship's entire crew in the hangar upon arrival out of curiosity about the kind of kid who made Eureka laugh. Faced with this wall of expectation, all Renton can manage is to stutter through question marks as everyone talks about how boring he is directly to his face. He's told to say something funny, and when he doesn't give an immediate response, it becomes apparent to everyone that he's just an ordinary kid, and they immediately lose interest, dispersing before him. Talho is the only one to stick around, and makes dreamy eyes at him just to see his flustered reaction before pinching his cheeks and letting him tumble to the ground. Holland, immediately comfortable at home and stripped to his trunks, hands Renton a tent and a sleeping bag, and makes a mental note to give him a job later. Eureka turns up to request that Renton sleep next to the Nirvash so that he can be close to it at all times. Any reasonable person would have choked back the word autistic and made an argument for why she was being ridiculous, but Renton eagerly takes her up on it out of infatuation and starts justifying the decision to himself by pumping up his necessity as a mechanic. Eureka ignores this and runs off at the sound of the word mama coming from a trio of children that, upon Renton realizing their presence, give him the death glare of infinite hate. Realizing that however it could possibly be explained, Eureka recognizes these children as her own, freezes Renton in such a feeling that only the end of the episode could possibly free him from it. I think that the whole first arc of Eureka 7, comprising the first 13 episodes, could possibly be titled the Entitlement Arc, in how it focuses squarely on pushing Renton to appreciate the depth of what it actually means to try and get something with your own hands. While Renton may have rejected the trajectory that his lifestyle was putting him on before, he was still nonetheless participant in that lifestyle because it was a path of least resistance for a child his age. School gave him a compulsory daily purpose, and his granddad gave him a bed, free food, and both the relative freedom to run around as he pleased, but also discipline and structure that cemented his sense of placement in his world. Upon landing on the Gecko, Renton is expecting someone to sit him down and explain what's going on, or show sympathy to his situation. But actually, all of these people have their own things to do and are incredibly free-spirited and personally driven, coming to him based on the expectation that someone as conceptually impressive as he seemed to be would have something to offer them, rather than expecting the opposite. It reminds me a bit of message board culture in the early 2000s, where it was often discouraged to spoon-feed information to new people, as it would lead to people constantly asking the same questions over and over, which they could easily find answers to simply by lurking on the board for a little while before making a post. Renton is wise not to have actually asked a full question, since he would have probably gotten comedically bullshit answers in response from people that aren't going to feel any qualms about keeping someone from information that they ought to be able to pick up on just by hanging around and being observant. If someone can't figure out what they have to do to be able to survive in an environment like this on their own, then they really aren't fit to run with this crew in the long run at all. After poring over these first 3 episodes again, I was fascinated by the thought that this constituted the main satisfaction which director Ikurosan had achieved in producing the whole of the series. Considering that he storyboarded these 3 episodes, it makes sense that he might feel more specifically attached to them than, say, episode 4, which is both storyboarded and directed by prolific key animator Takao Abo-san, who has gone on to direct Norn 9, the first season of The Rising of the Shield Hero, and the Weird Idol series 22/7 in recent years. Even still though, each of those first 3 episodes had its own credited episode director, and each one definitely came out feeling very different from one another. Episode director Miyagi Masayuki-san's first and 26 episodes are cinematic highlights of the entire series, with possibly the very most detailed art and animation and most artistically staged sequences, giving the impression like he was brought out as the heavy gun. He's also credited as an assistant director for episodes 12 through 20, which comprise the moodiest and darkest part of the series that we'll analyze in more depth when we get there. Miyagi-san's own full debut as a series director would come on the PlayStation original series Bonen no Zamdo, which would eventually be recast cut into one of the best looking TV anime ever constructed. Leading up to his role on Eureka 7, Miyagi-san was credited as an assistant director on the most critically acclaimed animated film of all time, Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away, and he could be seen doing extensive storyboard and episode direction on Overman King Gainer, which has all suggested to me that Overman King Gainer was actually pulling a lot of its talent from Studio Ghibli runoff, probably from people who were leaving after Miyazaki-san had supposedly quit for the first time, and those people who worked on King Gainer somehow trickled into the production of The Mars Daybreak and Eureka 7 when Bones started picking people up from that production. Miyagi-san would be a regular storyboard artist at Bones for a while, and more recently boarded a bunch of iconic Attack on Titan episodes across its seasons, and directed a 2012 film called Fuse with TMS Entertainment that I'm shocked to realize I've never heard of, as well as the 2002 Wit Studio film adaptation of Shika no O, which is yet to be available to me as of this writing. Episode 2's director, Murata Kazuya-san, likewise got his start with Studio Ghibli as an assistant director on Only Yesterday, likely part of the very same hiring wave as Eureka 7 character designer Yoshida Kenichi-san. Murata Kazuya-san would not stay with Studio Ghibli for long though, and had a much more chaotic route through the 90s, providing assistant direction for the first Berserk adaptation, episode direction in odd spots like on Gunsmith Cats and To Heart, and then on some of the more interesting original shows of the 2000s like Figure 17, Planets, and The Mars Daybreak, which at this point I've pretty much convinced myself to watch on curiosity over the strength of its staff alone. Murata-san would direct 7 total episodes of Eureka 7, and so I will have more space to analyze his directing style in particular as we get further into this video. But for now, I'll only state that the second episode was full of excellent visuals, but understandably without the filmic density of the first one. In the wake of Eureka 7, director Murata Kazuya-san would go on to be an assistant director and storyboarder for Code Geass, compose the script for Bones' Tokyo Magnitude 8.0, and direct the Fullmetal Alchemist Sacred Star of Milos film, and even create and direct Suisei no Gargantia with Production IG, and also create and direct the good-looking but poorly received AICO with Bones again. He also directed the very poorly received CGI series Kato the Right Answer and Starlight Promises, amounting to what at this point can best be called a very rocky career. I personally think that the problems in all of his later work are entirely within their screenplays, but that doesn't absolve him of fault for managing projects with such shitty scripts in the first place. At least his storyboard work on shows like Gundam Unicorn, Attack on Titan Season 3, and Orbital Children still has room to impress. The third episode's director, Sato Ikurosan, can best be described as a career episode director. He started off doing freelance work in the early 80s and then found his way into Studio Sunrise working on Mado King Grandzort in 1989, and then ended up on a whole bunch of their shows, including 11 episodes of Mobile Fighter G Gundam, 7 episodes of Cowboy Bebop, and 5 episodes of The Big O, among many other things, before he became a part of the Exodus Studio Bones. In fact, he directed the very first 2 episodes of their very first original show, Karakuri Kiden Hiwo Senki, and 6 more episodes after that, before doing as many episodes on Angelic Layer, assisting on the Bebop movie, doing 4 episodes of Razafon, 6 of Wolf's Rain, and of course 5 of The Mars Daybreak, among other things, before finding his way to directing 8 episodes of Eureka 7, including the finale. Notably, 3 of these are from storyboards by director Kyoda-san, including episodes 3 and episode 50. And he's continued to be a mainstay episode director at Studio Bones, most recently handling 6 episodes of Season 5 of Boku no Hero Academia. I also feel that I'll be able to get into Sato Ikuro-san's particular directing style once I've got more of his episodes to compare against one another, but mostly I'm just interested in how very different it feels from the first episode and how, in my opinion, comparably flat it is. My least favorite moment in this whole episode is actually the reveal of the gecko, because I think the camera angle makes it look way too small. This episode finds itself lapsing into lengthy panning shots and simplistically framed conversational scenes, which lead me to think that maybe the storyboards were interpreted a little bit more directly in this episode than they might have been in the previous ones, particularly the first. I realize it's unreasonable to expect the level of pure detail in the artwork that we got from the first episode to be consistent throughout the series, and episode 3 is also a step down from episode 2 in that regard, which itself was a step down from episode 1, leading to that feeling of starting to settle into stagnation that I got from the long start of this episode. I totally totally appreciate that the animators and designers should be given a chance to breathe when appropriate and when the scenes don't call for everything to be taken to the nines, but I also think that some of these situations could have been creatively reframed in a way that reduced the ambitiousness of the storyboards into something that would look better as a final product by being simplified. I suspect that the need for simplification in general contributed a lot to how the show would start to evolve as it moved beyond the opening episode. Going into the 4th episode of Eureka 7, I think it's fair to say that this is the point at which the story really has to carry the weight of the show's intrigue, and the audience must be counted on to have gotten invested at this point, as the production isn't trying to blow your mind anymore by now. This episode opens on a conversation between a bunch of obvious bad guys in a pretty boring location, having a very tropey conversation about unsealing some extra bad dude they put away at some point in the past in order to let him deal with the problem of the Nirvash having activated the Seven Swell phenomenon. I wouldn't go so far as to call this a bad scene, but its mundane camera work and relative lack of information density compared to scenes from the first 2 episodes are definitely counting on the audience to be invested enough by now to sit through more boring scenes like this. Most of this episode serves to introduce us to the crew and let us get a feel of the Gecko ship in deliberately mundane context. Renton is deeply frustrated that no one around him ever seems to lift at all, and with the boring reality of life on the Gecko. As he toils through basic and boring tasks amid the broken-ass Gecko state, Renton feels this strangling frustration with the fact that he ought to be happy to do whatever it takes to be a part of this group, and yet he can't convince himself that any of these people actually does anything impressive. Mostly they just seem boring, broke, and uncool, without any obvious redeeming qualities. Even getting the chance to ride in the Nirvash for the sake of testing its reactions to him doesn't fill Renton with a sense of freedom because he's made to look at the sky through a monitor in the cockpit. Behind his back, the older members of the crew are also trying to be patient with Renton. While he may have caused the Seven Swell, there's little evidence that he is actually having any effect on the Nirvash still, and the onboard scientist Misha expects it to take a while to see any results from their efforts in studying him. Even still, while Renton may have some untapped value, his clumsy attitude causes problems for others like Talho, and he enters a downward spiral of feeling like he's doing nothing but losing people's trust, and possibly actively driving them away from showing him how they live. Around halfway into this episode, I started to be struck by how very differently the characters are drawn in this episode from how they had been in the first 3, or would be in other episodes. Some of it is just a little bit wonky, and leaves the impression that this episode wasn't given to the A-team of animators working on the show. But beyond that, the art is also just kind of generally different. Faces and their features are a little blockier, and expressions a little harsher and more solid looking than they used to be. To really get to the heart of what's going on with the art here, I think it's important we talk about the many animation directors of Eureka 7. Character designer Yoshida Kenichi-san had served as animation director on the first episode, the 26th episode, and episodes 45 through 48 of the show. So I think it's fair to consider the artwork of those episodes to be the most core to the identity of Eureka 7, the closest to its intent. And those have this rounded, vibrantly expressive look which carries the clear influences of the ex-Ghibli staff that were working together to bring them to life. I am not at all surprised that these episodes represent the visual high points of the show, and would hardly expect any of the others to live up to that, even if the unique styles of other artists working on the series certainly left their own marks in places. Kuroshima Ayumi-san was the most frequent animation director on the series, handling 9 episodes in total, starting with episode 2. That episode gave us a lot of thin line work, open and understated expressions from the characters, and a general sense of reserved coolness as compared to the cartoonier expressiveness of the first episode. Having worked her way up as an animation director and assistant AD on a bunch of Razafon episodes, and then handling animation direction on episodes of other Bones shows on her way to Eureka 7, Kuroshima-san would graduate to the role of character designer on Bonen no Zamdo, and then later on Devilman Crybaby and the second season of Megalobox, and was also the chief animation director on Classroom Crisis and the currently releasing Eureka 7 High Evolution film series, even contributing to the design work of Mobile Suit Gundam Reconquista in G, for which franchise creator Tomino-sama had brought back character designer Yoshida Kenichi-san. Episode 3's animation director, which is shared with episodes 11 and 20, was career key animator and animation director Kodaira Yoshiyuki-san, who had been a notable animator for Cowboy Bebop that ended up as a Studio Bones mainstay, handling animation direction work and animation on 5 episodes of Boku no Hero Season 5 most recently. Animation in this episode is substantially looser than in the previous. Facial features have shrunken and seem to just sort of swim in the face sometimes, and there's an odd fixation on dramatic shading on the face over detail in the expression, as well as a few too many full profile shots. I do like how mundane some of Holland's faces are in this episode, and there's one pretty good use of variable line widths in this close-up of Eureka's face, but overall the animation ended up being one of the weaker aspects of that episode in my opinion. Maniwa Hideaki-san, who handled animation direction on the 4th episode, was doing freelance animation and AD work in the 80s and 90s, ending up at Studio Toei, doing 12 episodes of the Kindaichi Case Files, followed by 24 episodes of One Piece, all between episodes 30 and 218. He would be responsible for 8 episodes of Eureka 7, and so we will eventually have an extremely clear sense of the influence from his style, and it wasn't long after this show that he graduated to character designer on a show that I've somehow never heard of whatsoever, called Kamisama Kazoku for Toei, and then on a variety of interesting adaptations from Lovely Complex to the 2011 adaptation of Tezuka's Buddha to the aforementioned disastrous Kato the Right Answer, which at least had cool character designs if nothing else. And he's also animated on a whole lot of Precure shows. Maniwa-san's unique sense of expression is actually what ends up bringing the 4th episode to life for me. Aside from the incredible displays of palatable ache put into the face of Renton, there's a lot of subtle personality packed into the little movements we get with the rest of the crew, which really gives them each a distinct impression, even when they're all kind of acting towards the same goals in a situation. There are slight competing values amid the ship members, especially in the concern of the women over keeping the money flowing, but all of them are unified enough in understanding not to feel the need to address why they all dislike Renton's idea to compete in a refboarding competition to raise money. I think it's totally fair to think that these guys are kind of being assholes by refusing to explain themselves to any extent at all, but again, it's really more so that Renton's grasp on who they are is so far off that a simple explanation just won't be enough to make him really get it, and they certainly don't want to end up arguing. Attentive viewers will likely key in that the crew is trying to find an operation which will take them by the Trapar geyser explosion which Hap and Stoner picked up on over the radio at the start of the episode. To this end, the crew ends up on a smuggling mission through a dangerous military zone just for the sake of catching the baddest wave possible. Renton is finally inspired by his compatriots seeing this, only for the cargo spilling to cause him to realize that they've been transporting organs. He raises issue about this with Hap, stating that he would have handled things differently if he had known that they were transporting something that could be used to save human lives. Stoner corrects him though, saying that this was nothing so noble as that, just playing the middleman to the middlemen of the mafia, assisting some helpless sap to pay off his debts by selling his organs to some rich asshole. If the work wasn't dark enough on its own, Holland even reveals that the middleman of the middlemen tried to stiff them on the payment and underpaid them. Talho takes out her frustrations with that situation by hoisting her bathroom cleaning responsibility onto Renton, blaming him for not having come up with a better idea to make money. While Renton's cleaning the bathroom, Matthew finally feels fit to relent on him a little bit, explaining that the reason that they didn't take his idea before is that aside from the fact that they knew the Trapars would be weak at that competition and had heard about the geyser on the radio beforehand, they also just simply have a policy not to ref for money. It's something any of them could obviously do at any time to turn a quick buck, but considering how much of their existence is committed exclusively to catching the greatest possible waves, even when it means working for the mafia, murdering soldiers, putting their lives at risk, and getting shortchanged for their efforts, I think it's safe to say that the money is only as much as a concern as it has to be for them to live. Matthew also points out the obvious fact that Eureka's 3 kids aren't actually hers, and Renton thanks him for the sympathy and perspective before Talho grounds him right back down by asking what he would have felt if those kids actually had been Eureka's, which Renton has no answer for. I think this episode, in spite of its slower moments focusing on the bad guys, is possibly my favorite yet, in that it most indicates the trajectory of Renton and the Gecko State crew's development to come. I think delayed gratification is among the most important themes explored by this show, and something kind of difficult to communicate satisfyingly in a TV show that is supposed to be consistently entertaining all the way through. I find a couple of key factors this episode intriguing. Firstly, that we know about the Trapar geyser right from the start, and thus are ahead of Renton in realizing that there's more to the way everyone else is acting than just being dodgy and lazy. And secondly, that in spite of the mundane cinematography and the fact that the actual story of the episode is about Renton being bored and stifled with his surroundings, we as viewers are nonetheless getting the chance to explore a cool mothership and meet a bunch of interesting and eclectic characters that we might be more curious about than Renton is. Like in the first episode, we have a more objective perspective than Renton does, even though we also get to hear his personal thoughts on his situation, so we can empathize with him, but also understand his situation better than he does based on our ability to pick up on the nuances that he isn't grasping, either because of being older and wiser, or just having seen more of the show already. Episode 5 is one of my outright favorites of Eureka 7, but one that I expect to hit very differently with other audiences. It's a complete tonal shift from the previous episodes, with a lot of new staff making their first marks in the series at once, in what I would consider straightforwardly a sitcom episode. My favorite thing about Eureka 7's massive number of episodes is that it has room for stuff like this that almost doesn't push the so-called plot forward at all, and follows a very conventional trope-driven formula for its structure, allowing the characters and their personalities to take center stage, with a particular focus on realizing Talho and her unique chemistry with Renton. Earlier I talked about how Renton is very importantly presented with little brother energy, as a kid that obviously grew up looking up to a woman. Before I recognized myself as a trans woman, I had grown up clinging to my mom for pretty much my entire childhood, and very much got used to attending her along with shopping trips and listening to her fume about whatever's bothering her and the goings on in her life, and so I felt a certain comfort in being around older women as they went around their business, and found myself in situations like that one over the years, on my way to realizing that I basically had all these same intentions and interests to be in those places as the ladies I was there with. This is clearly not the case for Renton, who is more so being uncomfortably strung along, but it also makes perfect sense to me how he could show so little resistance to being bossed around by an older lady, even when she isn't really acting like a mature authority figure. I actually can't think of another anime episode off the top of my head that captures this chemistry quite so memorably, and so for me at least, this episode is kind of special. This episode was the first to be written by anyone other than lead writer Sato Dai-san, coming instead from Nomura Yuichi-san, who would end up writing 11 episodes in total, mostly in the show's midsection. Nomura-san's earliest writing credits are on 2 episodes of Overman King Gainer, and he would write a number of episodes on both seasons of Gundam Seed before handling some of the Mars Daybreak, and eventually working as the main writer on Bonen no Zamdo, and on the disastrous originals Comic Lucifer and AICO, amid a lot of writing for Toei shows aimed at younger audiences. Some of the situational dialogue here is especially funny. My favorite is after Renton pukes inside the Nirvash, and Eureka's kids tease him by asking their mom if they think a guy who pukes or doesn't puke is better. I appreciate the implications in certain episodes that the kids recognize how their mom doesn't understand human emotions very well and use it to their advantage in bullying Renton. I also enjoyed the classic TV schmaltz of Holland secretly buying Talho the ring that she wanted, only for it to get crushed, and then for her to convert it into a necklace, symbolizing how the sentiment of the object was always the aspect that mattered more than the ring in and of itself. It's cute, and it gives Eureka 7 the most feeling of being a proper TV show, with how it opens and shuts a story by episode's end, contributing to our overall understanding of the characters and their dynamics. Even more of the episode's comedy is carried by its eclectic animation, with moments that break the design meta or play with animation techniques in the name of creating memorable jokes. Talho's laughter as she storms through the halls ahead of Renton, animated from this perspective, which comes up twice, is particularly iconic. Interestingly, this episode was storyboarded by episode 2's director, Murata Kazuya-san, who also directed each of the other 5 episodes that he storyboarded, but not this one. That job instead went to Yokoyama Akitoshi, whose only contribution to Eureka 7 was directing this episode, leading me to wonder if a lot of its most unique aspects were the result of his influence. Yokoyama-san had by then been a long-time animator working with Sunrise and Bones, and started sporadically storyboarding and directing seemingly random episodes of all kinds of interesting shows over the coming decades, leading me to think that a specific deep dive on all of the episodes handled by this guy would probably yield some really interesting results. Thankfully, the animation director Mizuhata Kenji did handle 5 other episodes of the series, and so we should eventually get a more clarifying perspective on their influence. Mizuhata-san has worked mostly as a key animator all over the place in the 80s and 90s, settling into Studio Bones after contributing to Wolf's Rain, and sticking mostly to key animation, with occasional stints of animation direction on shows like FMA Brotherhood, Boku no Hero Academia, Carol and Tuesday, and the case study of Vanitas. Episode 6 is another sort of self-centered, very TV-like episode with a total switch to a new set of main staff in order to create a very particular feeling. This one focuses wholly on Renton's relationship to Eureka's kids, and is therefore inherently divisive amid audiences based on their patience for what are written to be realistically misbehaved and obnoxious children. Personally, I find their antics funny and largely adorable, but I also think it's funny to root for them against Renton since he kind of deserves the torment for being a dork. But I know a lot of people who really struggle with these episodes because they don't have any more desire to deal with someone else's kids in a TV show than they do to deal with them in real life. In any case, I think the way this show handles the relationship between Renton and the kids is very maturely written and follows a compelling emotional arc by episode's end. When looking into the staff before watching the episode, I was initially shocked by the level of talent poured into this one particular episode, considering that the director and storyboard artist are older and more accomplished than some of the show's main staff, and the animation director and writer would go on to even bigger things that I will get into specifically in just a moment. But all of that made sense when I realized that this episode was focused on child rearing, and had likely been given over to the older staff members who have the best understanding of parenthood. Renton's evolution from raising a fist at the kids only to be interrupted by their mother, to himself watching them accidentally mess up and feel terrible about it, and then reflecting on the way that he used to mess with his sister when she was trying to go on dates because he was afraid of having her taken away from him, which of course is something that eventually did happen. She was taken away. Empathizing with the kids, he helps them out, and though he puts them in a horribly dangerous situation in the process, it's hardly something anyone in Gecko State is in a position to criticize him for. In the end, the entire group of Renton, Eureka, and the kids are put in the brig as our first incredibly adorable suggestion of the family unit that they will be forming over the course of the story. Scriptwriter Kochi Ichiro-san was coming off of having written for Tomino's Turn A Gundam in 2000 when he turned up as a regular writer on the second Studio Bones production, their adaptation of Clamp's Angelic Lair. From there, he'd write a bit of Razafon, a lot of Azumanga Daioh and Overman King Geiner, for which he was lead composer, the Razafon film, which you'll remember had been Eureka 7 director Kyoto-san's directorial debut, every episode of Uchu no Stelvia, Planets, Maho Sensei Negima, before writing just 3 episodes of Eureka 7, though 20 and 26 are some of the best. In the wake of this show, he would go on to help director Taniguchi Goro-san in the creation and writing of Code Geass, and did series composition for Shigofumi, Kakumeiki Valve Rave, Cabaneri of the Iron Fortress, Princess Principal, Lupin the Third Part 5, and Skate the Infinity. If you know all of this work, you know that he is best known for over-the-top, plot and hype-driven sci-fi adventure action serials, which are hardly known for anywhere near the subtlety of his work on Eureka 7. Storyboard artist Nanba Hitoshi-san had been around since the 80s and had plenty of directing experience, most notably on the 2001 Baki the Grappler TV anime in the time before Eureka 7. And much more impressively had gone on to direct Hero Man and Go Sick with Studio Bones, and more recently the 3 seasons of Golden Kamui from Geno Studio. The only other episode of Eureka 7 that he storyboarded is number 28, which is one of the biggest dramatic episodes in the show, and both episodes spend a lot of time up close in the characters' emotions, which isn't necessarily so distinctive that it really stands out as a style inside of this series. Matsuo Shin-san is another director who only contributed this one episode to the series, and so it's tempting to think that its unique tone may be the product of his approach. Matsuo-san has appeared all over the place as a key animator, storyboard artist, and episode director, with his most substantial credits being all over Bones' Soul Leader adaptation from 2008. And I also can't help but be curious about how he only offered key animation on Eureka 7's 12th episode otherwise, which is the only other one to share animation director Tanaka Masayoshi-san. Tanaka Masayoshi-san is the one I'm most apt to credit for the quality of Eureka 7's 6th episode. If his name isn't familiar to you, or is so out of place in this context that you just didn't think about it being the same guy, Tanaka-san has become one of the best known character designers and animation directors in the entire industry, having handled those roles on Toradora, High School of the Dead, Anohana, Ano Natsu de Materu, Your Name, Darling in the Franxx, aka Fuckers in the Franxx, Weathering with You, and the weird idol show 22/7 that I know I mentioned sometime earlier in the script. Tanaka-san is frankly a legend, and the most probable connection I could find that led to him working on Eureka 7 is having contributed to Kawamori Shoji-san's Earth Maiden Arjuna before. It's not a surprise to me knowing that he was involved that the character art is so consistently beautiful in this episode and full of big, open expressions with a bit more sincerity to them than what we saw in the last one. Even though it's still also sort of a sitcom episode, this one is less sarcastic and more driven by the sincere emotions of the characters, which really comes through in the animation. Episode 7 is possibly my outright favorite of the whole series, and one of the most memorable anime episodes I can think of for its specific focus on trolling and hazing among a group of friends, and for the way that it's only become funnier and more relatable to me over the years as I've grown into the roles of the characters within. When I saw this episode for the first time, I actually remember disliking it and finding it confusing, because I wasn't totally clear on what was supposed to be going on, besides that it just seemed like the Gecko State crew were being assholes to Renton for no real reason. My perspective on this would be completely different by the time I saw the show again a year later, thanks to my own experiences being in a position more like Renton's. Being a bit autistic and moving all the time as a kid, without ever really getting a chance to know people on a more cultural level, I had a difficult time telling when people were making fun of me growing up, and I took it really hard when I got bullied bullied and made fun of. Nevertheless, always having wanted to be the best version of myself I can and live the best life possible, getting made fun of or told that I'm wrong made me defensive, but also sort of self-reflect and try to change my approach in the long run. Because I kept trying to put myself out there, meeting the reactions of others and trying to adjust to their expectations accordingly, I eventually started to get a sense of what was being expected of me, and also found better coping mechanisms for dealing with my inability to tell when I'm being teased. The first time that I found myself as a part of a sort of a loose collective filled with striking individuals that I wanted to prove my worthiness of proximity to was when I started writing my anime blog back in early 2007. As I discovered older, better writers who were inspiring me with their analysis of anime, I tried to emulate their writing in my own posts, and would leave comments on all of their blogs, often trying to draw them back to read my blog as well. I ended up receiving the most important mentorship of my life from older bloggers like Ghostlightning, whose We Remember Love blog was the pinnacle of analytical writing in the sphere, Otosan of the now gone Shameful Otaku Secret blog, which first taught me about the synthesizers that the Eureka 7's mechs are named after, before that information was being collected on Wikipedia. Loli Kitsune, whose blog I don't think exists anymore, and Bakuraptor, who's the only one still writing to this day, running a YouTube channel, who shows up in the comments here from time to time, so shout out to Bakuraptor all the way out in Japan. When I say that these were my mentors, I don't mean that they coddled me and taught me how to do things, although I can't possibly understate the kindness and patience shown to me by Ghostlightning in particular to educate me in life and writing. Perhaps the single most memorable moment I had as a member of this anime blogging community, though, came when Otosan pranked me in a very similar fashion to how Hap organizes the Troll Against Renton, and for very similar reasons. See, back in 2009, the writing style of my blog was incredibly abrasive and also very personal, bouncing between outright diary entries, extremely subjective reviews, and at the very best, some gonzo analysis approaching the style that I've continued evolving over the next 14 years. My blog was a total mess, but I was desperate for people to read it because it was all I really had going on in my life. And as I've made very clear in my content all the way to this day, the biggest incentive in creating it for me was in getting to see the reactions to and effects of the things that I have to say. My entitled mindset was such that people should want to read whatever I had to write just because I had written it. And truthfully, it took until I had worked through my personal battle with self-identity in my late 20s before I could really move past the part of me that insists on presenting every thought that enters my head to as many people as possible in an endless quest to get someone to explain myself back to me or something. Anyways, I wrote a post around then titled something like Anime I Haven't Talked About, which was basically just a couple paragraphs listing a bunch of shows that I haven't yet been able to figure out how to write about. It was a totally pointless filler post with a weird attitude, and Otosan had dunked on it with some of the other bloggers in one of their messenger chats for the fact that it was such a nothing burger of a post instead of just actually talking about the shows in question. As a result, he left a humorous comment telling me about a post that he wanted me to make. He wanted me to take one of those shows that I had mentioned and compare it against another show, then compare it against an unrelated piece of media, insisting that I get into the bones of it, and that I don't fuck this up. And then afterwards, he encouraged everyone else to leave similar comments, and so by the time I woke up and checked my blog the next day, I had 32 comments, the most I'd ever seen on one of my posts. Initially from a handful of bloggers that I knew, some of them posting more than once, and eventually spreading out to include other bloggers that I was vaguely aware of, but each of them had about 4 sentences of the same format of post, telling me to get into the bones of comparing this thing to this other thing and not to fuck it up. As I scrolled through this wall of comments, I felt a whirlwind of emotions. On the one hand, I was obviously being punked on, and worse, by a bunch of people I respect and admire, and who I want to think that I'm a good writer. On the other hand, the comments were fucking hilarious, and by the time I got to like the 6th one, I was laughing out loud at each new attempt to get more ridiculous with the post suggestions, and inventive with the placement of the phrases get into the bones of it, draw a parallel, and don't fuck this up in every post. All kinds of answers to what had happened and to individual comments swirled through my head, but there was one prominent thing I felt above all of the rest upon reading these suggestions. I actually wanted to write some of these posts. And so what I did was to launch into the Don't Fuck This Up series, an adventure to answer every single one of the post suggestions with a fully realized editorial, really getting into the bones of it and not fucking it up. I didn't end up adapting every single comment, but I did the stunt that everyone really wanted me to do the most, which was to realize Otosan's suggestion that I take my list of my top 100 favorite anime characters, get into the bones of how each of them is a reflection of the nature of otaku, and then draw a parallel between them and my own otakudom, as well as the first episode of Crest of the Stars, for reasons that you'll have to read the post to understand. Over the course of 20 days, I answered this call in batches of 5 characters at a time, and then petered out at the next ridiculous idea when it was clear the joke was over and everybody moved on. Answering this call to action did not prove to anyone what I had thought I had wanted to prove before I started writing it. I thought I wanted people to think that I was a writer with an interesting perspective. But since that was clearly not the case, instead I realized that what I could do was create something and so entertaining specifically to the audience that it was made for, that it could justify my existence to them. Eventually, I have gotten all of the respect that I desired from those exact people in more than satisfying amounts over the decades. If anything, by now, I'm just sad that none of those great writers have stayed in the anime space for me to keep looking up to, even if I'm lucky that at least they're on Twitter sometimes. In the time since I wrote my first full series analysis on Eureka 7 in 2008, amounting to my longest series to date at like a fourth of what I've written for this video so far, I've gone from being in Renton's place in life at the start of the series to being in Holland's place in life closer to the end of the series. So anyways, this episode, Hap, Stoner, and Matthew release Renton from the brig 7 days into Holland's 10-day sentence, figuring that they'll have more fun milking entertainment out of him than leaving him in confinement. If you recognize the device used by ramen delivery drivers in Japan, then you might start laughing the very moment that you see it framed in this mysterious fisheye perspective like it's full of dry ice or something. Renton is innocently convinced that this bowl of ramen is some kind of bomb that he needs to deliver, and of course needs to wear a ridiculous disguise while he does it. Unbeknownst to Renton, Moondoggy is sent to livestream his adventure back to the guys on the ship, the kids, and Doggy's girlfriend Gidget. I love that when Hilda admonishes her husband and the others for hazing the rookie, and he states that it's an affectionate tradition, she retorts that if she gets that kind of affection, she's punching him in the face. That's the tack I would use at this point in life to anyone who thinks it would still be funny to try and prank or haze a grown woman with shit to do. The situation becomes a little more interesting when we realize that Moondoggy has also been made to wear a ridiculous outfit while tailing Renton, even if it looks a little bit more stylish on his himbo figure. And he's being chewed out by the crew back at home for his feelings as a cameraman. As someone that has now actually been a part of actual productions like this, doing man-on-the-street camera work and trolling people for video content, I felt flashbacks to my producer yelling at our cameraman not to end up being the cringe that we're trying to capture on camera. I think any of us who at one point were on the loser end of the joke, and then sort of had to try and fight our way to being on the side that knows what it's doing, has experienced the awkward middle zone of Moondoggy, where he's no longer the center of the trolling, but also isn't quite on the level where he can participate in the trolling without catching some of the cringe fallout. And that's exactly where the rest of the episode takes us. As the situation unfolds, it becomes clear that the point of this mission is to ask Renton to do something so ridiculous that he won't be able to bring himself to do it, or otherwise to see how much crazy stuff they can get him to actually go through with. As soon as they get Renton to agree to figure out who is wearing a wig in a sauna full of what are implied to be gangsters by the dragon tattoos on their backs, by tugging on their hair, they conclude that Renton is a true genius, and that they aren't surprised that Moondoggy is jealous. Unable to watch this cringe up close any longer, Moondoggy blows the mission and takes Renton out to a cafe and buys him an oversized sundae. From Moondoggy's perspective, it ought to be so obvious at this point that Renton is being fucked with, that he keeps getting more and more annoyed every sentence that Renton just continues to justify himself, a robust meaning behind every aspect of their scenario, as Doggy just sits in silence, scowling, and the men back at home are stupefied that something like this is even possible. Renton's sincere happiness over what he perceives as Doggy's sympathy is so powerful that he ends up bringing himself to tears, and Stoner decides that this is the official pendulum moment after which it's hard to predict who's going to come out of the situation, giving them the best cringe comedy performance. Doggy ends up being the one to blow it, as Renton's sincerity seems so impossibly real that he decides it has to be an act and explodes on Renton, accusing him of making fun of him, a projection of his own insecurity over his inability to completely distinguish what is real or is a joke at his own expense, being writ large with Renton. Even after this meltdown, Renton still interprets Doggy's actions as tough love from which he can derive self-betterment, and reaches a crescendo of sincerity which unintentionally comes squarely at Doggy's expense when Renton calls him Doggy Nissan in total seriousness. The second Doggy hears this repeated back from someone else over his headset, he knows that it's another thing he's never going to hear the end of, and that it came from someone that won't even admit that it's their own fault. Even when Doggy takes Renton to the ground and starts beating him up, Renton can't be convinced that the situation is fake. The huge bodybuilder with a tattoo of Holland on his back, turning up to tell them to stop fighting, is the kind of perfection of craft that only TV writing can create, and so the men give Renton the climactic order to make fun of the man's height and get the bowl of ramen poured on his head, finally proving to him the farce of the situation. Back aboard the ship, Hap, Stoner, and Matthew seem to have talked through any hard feelings about the prank with Renton, but mostly he's just hurt by the thought that Eureka was watching him and laughing behind his back with everyone else. He confronts Doggy about the fact that he knew and was laughing at Renton all along, but Doggy admits that he was actually jealous of Renton because he had enjoyed the attention of getting bullied by the others, and thusly wasn't really able to give them the kind of sincere reactions that Renton was, since he knew that he was being made fun of. Seeing Renton's sincerity and talent has made Doggy feel a respectable loss, and he shakes Renton's hand over it, but it seems like because of his impressionistic surfer lingo, Renton actually doesn't understand what he's saying at all. At the end of the episode, Eureka tries to cheer Renton up by bringing him a bowl of ramen, and the sting of the irony is such that Renton inwardly has a moment not unlike Moondoggy did, where he wonders if Eureka is actually making fun of him, or even just pitying him. Actually though, Eureka ends up thanking him for inspiring so many smiles amid the crew and apparently positive feelings in the Nirvash. And when Renton asks if she sees him as uncool, she answers that she isn't even sure what that means. Happy to hear this, Renton just tells her to stay the way she is, and realizes exactly what makes Eureka so appealing to him. She's even more sincere and even less capable of reading the room than he is. At the end of the episode, we then see Holland watching the tape of the day's events on his own, laughing and calling himself lame, after hearing Renton state something that he finds personally relatable about how he hasn't completed anything, but has just let himself get depressed. The emotional undercurrent of this episode runs a lot deeper when you learn more about what the Gecko State was up until Renton's arrival. Having started off as military, Holland, Eureka, Misha, and Talho came from a dark place and didn't exactly lighten up just because they started running a counterculture movement. Most of the younger, lighter-hearted members of the crew are just kind of along for the ride compared to the core crew that consists of very serious adults dedicated to doing their jobs and keeping to their particular hobbies. While there's a clear bro culture between Holland, Matthew, and Stoner and Hop, and the people on the Gecko make a point to find places to have fun, the impression that we get of the atmosphere aboard the ship at the start is a lot more tense than it seems to be once everyone starts enjoying themselves by witnessing Renton's sincerity. Holland himself, after all, is the one whose jealousy towards the effects of Renton's presence will be most thoroughly commented on from here on out in the show. Suga Shotaro-san wrote this episode, and I have to imagine that he found his way to writing 9 episodes of Eureka 7 by way of meeting head writer Sato Dai-san in the writer's room of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. Given how much the events of this episode reminded me of my experiences not only as a blogger, but even on anime forums as a kid, I can't help but feeling like Suga-san and Sato-san might have bonded over their mutual understanding of internet communication. After Eureka 7, Suga-san would write a lot of episodes for Bones' Blood Plus, Darker Than Black, and Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and for Production IG's Seirei no Moribito, Les Chevaliers d'Eon, and the Solid State Society movie. He also worked as series composer for Rine no Lagrange, My Youth Romantic Love Comedy Snafu, the first season of Uchoten Kazoku and Seven Deadly Sins, One Week Friends, and Dimension W, which would be his last production before his death on March of 2015. Rest in peace. The episode's direction and animation direction were handled by freelance key animator and animation director Ito Hideki-san, who also got his start as an animator on Ghibli's Only Yesterday, and then appeared all over the place through the 90s and early 2000s, including as an animator on Razafon, and animation director for 8 episodes of Fullmetal Alchemist, before doing the same for 5 episodes of Eureka 7, 3 of which he also directed, and then continuing to show up all over the place over the decades. Ito-san is given a heavier load than any other animation director since the first one on this episode, thanks to the much more zoomed out and filled in storyboards, courtesy of episode 1 and 26 director Miyaji Masayuki-san providing the boards for this episode. Even though it doesn't have the resplendently exquisite artwork of the 2 big episodes actually directed by Miyaji-san, his storyboards make an ideal example for explaining the strength of great storyboard artists specifically. Every shot in this episode seems to find the most kinetic framing that involves the largest number of bodies on screen, expressing something unique which contributes to the overall emotions of the scene. In particular, the shots of all the characters on the couch are a technical marvel of clever framing, expressive posing, and different ways to capture similar reactions to something under observation. Just the difference in the way that the sexy Gidget rests over the back of the couch versus Hap standing with his legs at exact shoulder distance apart and back straight, even though she's young and fit and he's old and out of shape, tells you a lot about their personalities, and it's fun to see how all of these very different people can be united or divided in their various sentiments. And that's as far as I'm going with this episode of this Eureka 7 series. Since I ended up talking about episodes 2 and 3 at such length, we haven't made it too far. I'm probably going to cover the entire rest of the first arc in the next video, so everything up through episode 13. Would have done that in this, but god, this is just so long. It's unbelievable. Thank you for watching. Remember that the uncut versions of these videos are all available on Odyssey. Once all of the videos have been completed, they will be compiled into one very large Eureka 7 video. There will be a version of that hopefully can get onto YouTube, but again, the uncut versions are all on Odyssey. Support me on Patreon, patreon.com/goldenwitchfire, or go to goldenwitch.substack.com to subscribe for bonus articles and podcasts. Be sure to listen to my other podcasts that I do that are linked in the description, such as the Jittery Zeitgeist Hip Hop Review Show and the New Void Gazers podcast, which are both on the ASE Presents channel. I appear on that channel a lot. I work with the people who run it. I am even on their Patreon, patreon.com/ASE Presents, and some of their bonus content. So yeah, check all that out. Everything else you can find linked in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Never forget, anime forever.